On this podcast, you'll find interviews with high-performing, successful individuals in life sciences. On a weekly basis, we cover their proven methods, principles, strategies, and mindsets to implement new technologies that scale to meet the needs of people in our world.
Welcome to Life Science Success Podcast. My name is Don. I'm a consultant in life science, and I am very excited to welcome our guest today. But before we hop into the interview, I wanted to quickly mention D3 Digital Media. D3 employs decades of life science experience and innovative technology to develop and define digital marketing strategies for healthcare companies so that they can build their digital voice, increase awareness, and drive leads, positioning themselves effectively in the competitive marketplace. The key things that we work on are things like websites and SEO, social media, live events and webinars, just like the event that you're watching now. And so for companies that are looking to have a webinar that's not structured like a standard slide presentation that's boring with people, presenting and no engagement. Those are not the things that we typically do. We typically do things that are very engaging, like the thing that we're about to do here with John. So John Alderete has successfully applied his wide range of experience and formal training to the evolution, financing, formation, and operation of diagnostics and medical device technology companies. So with that, welcome, John.
Thank you. Good morning, Don.
Yeah, I'm very excited to get to talk about Folium and the things that you're working on as well. And so would you just take a moment and tell the listeners a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. I'm a kind of a Renaissance guy. I'm a scientist by training. I'm a virologist from University of Washington, but opted not to become a scientist in that sense. So I went the consulting route and did consulting for multinational companies on the product level, but then started the long, arduous path of being a serial entrepreneur, starting companies in the diagnostic space. And I've taken some detours along the way, worked for Stanford School of Medicine. I've had my own brewery along the way as well, but ultimately keep finding myself back into the startup space.
Yeah, and you're even earlier than I am. So my thing about my tongue not working properly because it's so early isn't really a good excuse, because it's not 2 a.m. or something like it is for you.
It's 2 a.m. here for sure, and you actually have me at a bit of a disadvantage. I haven't even had coffee yet. It was a little bit too early for coffee. You have me at my rawest.
Well, I guess that will be make for an interesting interview at the very least. And so I mean, I guess maybe let's peel back a little bit, some of this thought in terms of what made you, I mean, as you graduated, what made you sort of want to focus on the consulting side and not want to be on the bench?
Well, my father was a scientist, and I basically like to say I grew up in a lab, which isn't too far from the truth. And so I've been around academic research as long as I can remember. And when I was a graduate student myself, I had a chance to participate in other groups. At the time, they were named the Washington Biomedical and Biotechnology Association. So I'd go to meetings and see how industry side worked. And very quickly became aware that there was a big disconnect between how the business people in medtech and biopharma were talking versus how the scientists were talking. They weren't really speaking the same language. And so I was very interested in that chasm and wanted to be a part of the solution of being able to be that person in the middle. So being business and science. And that was ultimately my goal. So that's what prompted me to go off and not continue to do bench work, although ultimately we ended up doing that with our companies. But I went through the consulting route to see how the big boys essentially did product development.
Yeah, and then I mean, it seems that it's also led you to entrepreneurship as well.
Well, it's kind of a sickness, I guess, once you start a company and you develop a very keen skill on how that process works. It's a hard thing to leave. There's so much creativity there, and you get to meet some incredible people along the way. So being a naturally creative person, I guess I gravitate towards being an entrepreneur more than working behind a desk for a larger company. I did my stint at Stanford, and I was nearly crawling out of my skin. So I couldn't wait to get back on the horse again.
That's interesting to think about as well. I mean, there's just, I think, I mean, obviously there are different types of people and different types of approaches that I think that we all wind up taking. And I feel like there is a definite need for individuals that sit at that sort of intersection of, okay, so I personally am not a research scientist. I'm a consultant who sits in the middle of, business and science as well. And what's interesting and somewhat frustrating to me sometimes is people that continually treat their company as if it is a research project. And I mean, I get that research is important. It's absolutely critical, but there has to be a point in time. And I had a conversation earlier this week with somebody who essentially had an approved FDA device. So it's ready to go. They hadn't thought about commercialization and they hadn't finalized manufacturing. And I was like, I mean, essentially, and where they're back at now because of the fact that they don't have a way, there isn't a clear path to cash. They're back looking for investors. And I said, good luck. I mean,
Yeah, that's a tough position.
I don't think there's many investors that would look at you and invest $1 because you have a device that you could sell. Why aren't you selling it? And everybody's going to be asking you that very question. So I said I would be very prepared for that question. And I don't know that there's many people at this point, other than somebody, that's willing to sort of, roll up their sleeves and help you, get your device out the door, which I would do. But, leadership has to be behind it. Right. So, and at this point, they're still saying that they want to go do research. And I was like,
yeah, there's so many trappings and everything that you just said. Obviously, the cynical part of me as an entrepreneur I've participated in all of these discussions, and I've heard the no's from every different angle from investors. And you become quickly aware that there are knowledge gaps everywhere, and you can't really satisfy everybody all the time. I don't know anything about the product. It could be the bee's knees. But as you mentioned, if they don't have a path to commercialization or other elements that are critical to developing their value in the eyes of investors, it's going to be a long road. So in terms of thinking about research, I think this is a bit of this sort of bifurcated issue here. One is I've seen over the course of my career lots of scientists who come out of academia who have a research project that they think is a company. And that's not really how it works. Nobody really wants to pay for research. And so my approach, having seen how academia works, is I like to focus on things that come out of research institutes and universities, but have bodies of knowledge behind it. So it's not really research anymore. It's more applied application of that science. And but even if you get to that point, the discussion with potential funders is difficult because they see it purely as research, even though it's a development issue project, not research. So there are lots of factors that go into this, and it's there's always, it's like raising a child. There's always some other issue that pops up. Once you think you've figured something out, it's really challenging.
Yeah. It's where I look at the entrepreneurs and I go, you whenever you're the CEO of a life science company, especially a new startup, you have a portion of time whenever you're definitely heads down and you're looking at a lot of tactical stuff for a good amount of time. And then once you get through that tactical stuff, you better have your eyes on the horizon and what's coming at you next, because there is an unpleasant surprise, I'm sure, waiting for most entrepreneurs right around the corner. And you have to kind of understand a little bit about the path that you're going to walk, because if you only know what you know from research, or you only know what you know from business, neither one is going to help you. You have to have this collaborative sort of fit where you just go, okay, there's a level of expertise that I need, on both sides. And
right.
Yeah,
that's correct.
So tell me more about Folium Biomed. What are you working on, and what's underway?
Well, Folium Biomed. I'm gonna step back and throw out a bit of a broad topic. We don't have to talk about it, but it really is the foundation for Folium Biomed. And as an entrepreneur, anybody who's gone through the selling of equity for a company realizes that what we're really talking about, and where a lot of issues arise for startups, frankly, at any stage of their life, even when they're more mature, is a question of control, right? Because once you sell a part of your company, somebody else has control. And sometimes, and I might say often, those elements are not aligned. The people invest in you and what you're trying to do are not necessarily aligned because they have a pure financial interest, and the founders may have other interests aside from being purely monetary. And I have, and I know others have experienced this. When we are CEOs of startups, we try to provide our stakeholders optionality. So we don't like being one trick. I don't like being one trick pony company. I like building value. And the problem with that is if you build value into a company with multiple different potential revenue options, and something goes wrong with that company, all of that optionality is locked in that company, right? So you lose a lot of potential value there. And I've experienced this myself. It's quite frustrating. And Folium Biomed was basically born as a holding company. And, I have a team, quite proficient and fantastic group of scientists and regulatory experts. But we basically will take a technology and put it into Folium Biomed, and we spin it out as an individual company. And that way, if that company goes down in flames, it doesn't take out the other efforts that we're working on. And so that's really what Folium is. It's a holding company. It's a model that I've seen in Silicon Valley a couple of different times in different iterations. We're just not as sexy in that sense.
Yeah, in terms of I guess in terms of let's kind of peel back a little bit more on the assets, right? So one of the things I heard you say was that, I mean, if you have a bunch of, let's say, a series of assets and they're all together, if one fails, they're all somewhat tied together. How is your model different?
Well, I can give you hypotheticals in this case, but let's just say, for example, we had a diagnostic test for, well, let's make it relevant for today for the SARS-CoV-2, right? And our diagnostic test had an application in multiple different sampling types.
Mm-hmm.
We had some diversity with sampling types, and those sampling types had applications in other business areas for other viruses. Let's just say, but something happened to that company, and maybe we had intellectual property surrounding multiple different components of our testing pathway. And if that company had any sort of issue, it couldn't seek funding, whatever the issues may be, there are many of them, all of that intellectual property would go away, multiple elements of it. What we choose to do is we choose to take a singular piece of intellectual property, and then form a company around that. And if we have other elements that add value to that, we'll form companies around that and license into the main effort. That way, if there's an issue with the main company, we don't lose the other assets that themselves have their own value. So it's really just a question of protecting ourselves from, well, essentially, the other varied interests that are buying into the company, which can, like I said, can be at odds.
Yeah. And I kind of think about, I mean, I you look at a larger, whether it's pharma company or diagnostics company, right? I mean, they will have a portfolio of things, one that are out in the public, and two that they're working on behind the scenes. And similarly, right? I mean, they're not locked one way or the other. Right. And I personally tried taking a similar sort of approach with a few other assets as well. I tried this approach, I think, like a year and a half ago. And I remember, speaking to like some individuals that were investors that, just essentially, had invested in similar types of assets that I was interested in sort of bringing forward. And they had said, there's a lot of risk that sort of comes with this approach. Cause I essentially I had said, look, why not pick like a menu of things that all work on the same disease type or the same, sort of thing. And similarly, they were sort of cautioning doing that because they were like, one, it raises the amount of capital that you have to have. And then two, the challenge becomes what happens if one asset fails where the other ones don't. So
yeah, fair enough. I guess for me, the story and the lesson at the end of the day is you really can't satisfy everybody, right? So regardless of the approach, there's always going to be an issue with it. And so you really have to find the approach that works best for you and your team. And this has worked for us pretty well. It allows us to be pretty nimble. And I think it's important for me to articulate that any of the companies that we build aren't intended to be brick and mortar companies. And for us, that's really important because our goal is to satisfy the pipeline of larger strategic partners. This is what I did as a consultant, understood what their pipeline needs were. And so we build companies essentially to be an asset to larger partners. So we don't have time to really worry about getting immersed into complexities of what's stakeholders may or may not want or how we're going to grow. For us, it's pretty simple. We have a goal, we have a target, we have an end game, and we try to make that as linear as possible.
Very interesting. And so are you at a point now where you are accepting other technologies or yeah?
I'd like to say that Folium would be successful if my team was 5 times as large. The truth of the matter is that we're so involved in one particular technology. We essentially just do serial companies, one after the other. We don't have multiple projects. Now we have technology sort of waiting in the wings that we know we're going to approach once this current project is over. But we don't have multiple projects going on at the same time. We just don't have the bandwidth, to be honest with you. I'd love to do that, but it's just not possible.
Yeah. I completely understand. And so, I guess explain to me a little bit more of, if I'm a company out there and I happen to be listening to the podcast, and I'm looking for either investment and I, might think that I fit into your portfolio. Is this something that you're interested in having further conversations with companies?
Sure, no problem. And as an aside, so Folium doesn't really do work for hire. We've been approached to do that. We're quite capable of doing that, but like I said, we're so focused on the projects that, well, frankly, I'm interested in. It's the benefit of being the boss. But I do have plenty of conversations with other companies and sort of helping them with their development pathway or their regulatory needs, kind of acting like a consultant. But we have in the past as a team assisted with other companies and their efforts. We have some incredible scientists behind the scenes. I'm absolutely not one of them, but we do have them. So I'm always happy to talk to other companies. And quite frankly, you never know where there are potential synergies these days. And I find that those synergies between companies can be a very powerful tool and very attractive to larger entities that are looking for more robust technologies. So I'd highly encourage them if they want to try to reach out to me. That's totally fine.
Yeah, and I think given kind of the environment, right? I do feel a bit like there's an awful lot, and you said it just a minute ago that there's lots of reasons why companies object, but I feel like there's an awful lot of presenting that happens, especially right now, even when, and I don't know, part of the cynical side of me says, if from the very beginning, if your answer was going to be no because of a variety of reasons, and number one being that you just don't have the money to invest, then my thought is, as critical as investors are, I have the same criticism, I guess, back, which is, make the decision quick and don't waste the entrepreneur's time, right? I mean, nobody has the time to just keep presenting one time after the other, only to get to the end to say, the very first presentation, you told us something that told us that we weren't going to invest, and we've more or less validated that assumption now. And it's like, well, in the first presentation, why didn't you tell us that you essentially had made that determination? We could have saved ourselves two more rounds of this pain where we're trying to sort of clarify a point that you've already deemed wasn't a good pathway forward.
You've touched on something that's so incredibly important, and it's becoming. I think it's becoming easier now, thanks to the internet and the information that's available. I mean, prior to all of the information that's readily at our fingertips, we didn't have any clue how VC worked or angel groups worked, or it was a complete black box, right? And it really was who you knew, not really what you knew. And to some extent that still exists to this day, but there's so much information that exists for entrepreneurs and investors for that matter. We still have a huge gulf between the conversation between the two entities. And investors aren't, like you just said, telling the entrepreneurs this is what we're really specifically interested in, and the entrepreneurs aren't really presenting it in the best way. And this has actually been a lifelong quest for me. Scientists in particular, this as well as being a PhD, we like to bring people to a point of agreement based on information and facts. So we like to overshare,
Right.
and completely irrelevant to people who are you're pitching for investment. They literally don't care. Now, maybe they'll get to it because they typically have some science expertise behind the scenes, but in the initial phase, none of that matters. And that really takes some getting used to. And that's a skill, especially for scientists and science-oriented people to acquire. So it's an ongoing balance. I do think, however, just to go on a bit of a tangent, I do think that VCs, in particular in the life science sector, aren't really asking the questions they think they're asking. And as a very simplistic example, there's been an interest in moving towards earlier stage investments in the life sciences, and this you can see this at the recent JP Morgan Chase meeting in San Francisco this past January. A lot of interest in moving towards earlier stage investments, but there's still earlier stage investments. And when they say,
Right.
"Oh, well, we're interested in seed investing," and you go to them with, or pre-seed investing, well, we go to them with a pre-seed investment opportunity. It's not mature enough.
Right.
So there is a bit of a disconnect with the language that's used and the expectations. That's an ongoing issue, but I think we have tools now that are finally allowing us to understand each other from a different level.
Yeah, and I think I mean this I mean that certainly everybody knows kind of what happened with Theranos as well, right? Where the technology was way oversold in terms of what it could actually deliver, and essentially the investors were completely sold a bag of goods. But on the other side, if you have people who are good researchers that are essentially bringing data, right, and saying this is, at a very early stage, it is a very risky proposition still. And that's kind of the last thing most investors want to hear. They want to hear, oh, there's a clear pathway. And that clarity doesn't oftentimes happen in our space until, kind of the middle of the project or even the end.
I think this is a big issue that you just touched upon, because in the life sciences, we're talking about biology. We're not talking about widgets or computer components. It's just not the same. And we personally choose to focus on diagnostics in the infectious disease space, and we use some very well tested technologies. But at the end of the day, we still rely on cells, biological materials that can fail. There's no guarantee. So our potential for risk is much higher. And if that's not something that you're comfortable with as an investor, you really don't need to be in this space. Because what ends up happening, and this is my personal pet peeve, and this is because it's 2:30 in the morning, I'm unfiltered saying this. If we take a look at a lot of investments in the healthcare, quote unquote, healthcare sector, a lot of it is technology oriented, not really innovative in the true life sciences area. It's better patient record manipulation or aggregation, better ability to capture bills that aren't paid, or whatever it is. It's not really life science investing. It's sort of systems investing, and that's a big problem. So originally, when you and I talked about this opportunity to speak with you, I said we were working on a funding approach, and that's still ongoing. This is going to take some time, but one of the things that we, as a group of us behind the scenes, realize is that we are missing out on a lot of truly innovative human health changing technologies, and they're just being looked over. And part of this is we have this funding gap, the valley of death, that I'm sure you've talked about before, perhaps on the show, between the sort of basic science and the applied science arenas.
Yep.
And I stumble with my words because it's so incredibly awkward to see and hear about stories and see with my own eyes venture capitalists walking the halls of Stanford looking for the next greatest thing, but you never see them again because they simply don't understand what it is they're looking at or even looking for. They don't know what questions to ask. And recently for me, I was in Southern California last year, or late last year, talking with a life science venture group. And I knew I was in trouble when I had to explain what antibodies were. Now, fundamental biology here. And if we can't even move past that, there's no hope of understanding, how we're going to take our expertise and apply it to a relatively simple problem. It's a bit of a mix right now.
Yeah.
You touched a bit of a nerve here, Don.
Well, I mean, I think it's a bit of a nerve for all of us, especially right now. I know with one of the companies that I'm working with, I mean, I think we've had over 25 pitch sessions. We've narrowed it down to like 3 or 4 potential finalist investors who are, going through our data room and things like that. But it's an interesting process to sort of watch, and there are just parts of me that just are like, I certainly understand the idea that scientists need to learn how to tell a story, and we've sort of taken the approach of rather than having a traditional founder's video, we have a video that sort of tells the story of the company and why this is a problem inside of the industry in a very short, sort of 2 to 3 minute, kind of video that explains very clearly this is what the technology is. And then moving on, this company has some tremendous capability, and I feel really for the initial founders of the company, because they've been doing this for over a decade. They've been sort of, working on this idea for over a decade. And here I am coming at the end stage of trying to bring it, through funding. And I'm just sitting here going, I mean, there's some companies that clearly don't understand. And why not just tell us at the very beginning you don't understand, and we'll, find a way to break it down so that you do. And if you still don't think it's a spot for you to invest, please make the determination early, because time is precious. So.
Yeah, there are many tragic stories like that for sure. And it's absolutely heart-wrenching to watch, because a lot of these technologies are truly cool and would be helpful, to patient health or human health.
Right.
Yeah, it's hard to watch.
Yep, absolutely. So, John, what's some of the best leadership advice that you've ever received?
I haven't had that many mentors. A lot of my learning has come through experience and getting knocked down a lot. So one of the best things that I could possibly, at least when I start out, and I'm a bit lucky this way because we've sorted this out already, is you have to have the right team. And I think there's a misconception about how teams work, that there has to be harmony, right? Or there has to be an authoritative leader, or whatever the tropes are. The truth of the matter is good teams are very dynamic, and there's conflict in teams. It's how you resolve that conflict that's important. And you get a lot of your great ideas born out from those discussions. So having that team is phenomenal. Not bringing on people just because they have historical significance, your buddy, your lab mate, or whatever, that invariably causes issues. The one thing that I've learned over the years is that I don't care who you think your teammates are, the prospect of money does weird things to people. Typically, people start pre-spending in their mind. It doesn't even exist yet, but hope is a powerful thing. It can also be a very destructive thing. So I think being prepared for understanding that people's self-interests tend to come out more than the team's interests when they think there's an advantage to be gained. And that can come from your own team, that can come from board members, that can come from all sorts of different sources when they think that there's something in it for them that they can get at the expense of others. I've seen that plenty of times. The other element I think that's important is, and this was a lesson in the discussion that I heard recently, didn't necessarily apply to us so much, but if you're a company making just another X, Y, and Z product that's marginally better than something on the market currently, completely uninteresting. And it very may well be that that's your technology, that's fine, but how to think about that in the context of creating a new channel, something that's actually innovative, not just marginally better. That is a challenge, and it's not applicable to everybody. But I think the data show that if you're just a company that makes something that's just slightly better, you're not going to be on the market that long, even if you are successful being commercializable. So I think those are some of the big ones that we think about going forward, and we try to approach those elements as we start each company.
Yeah, absolutely. We did get a question. I oftentimes I don't bring these up, but I'll just sort of pop it up here on the screen as well. So the question is, we know investors don't understand too much on research. How can technology experts get access to the IP in a collaborative way with scientists and productize the research?
The technology experts are coming from the investors?
Well, I think yes, yeah.
Okay, so I think again, to sort of harp back on this, and I don't mean this in a demeaning way, but the technology almost doesn't matter when you're having those initial discussions. It is literally the investors are coming in and they're looking at it from an investment and return standpoint. That's it. So you need to be able to address the question, the typical things. What's the problem? How are you going to solve it? And the fallacies in those kind of discussions are not knowing what your exit is, not truly accurately representing what the forecasting may look like. But if those investors are worth their salt, they will have technologists behind them, people like me, for example, that they can go to and say, what do you think about this? Right. And that's really where the power happens. So you have to get past that initial discussion first before you can even begin to start thinking about presenting that technology to them. You can answer the question, do you guys have patents? Yes. Or we're filing provisionals. Those are easy answers. They don't need to see the patents. They don't need to read them. They don't want to read them. So don't present them. Keep it simple.
Yeah. That idea of making fitting the presentation for the audience is absolutely critical, and kind of understanding that the initial audience is normally a series of individuals who are screening lots of different ideas, right? So their position is to screen, and then the second round is the deeper level of technologists, right? So they're normally, like you said, there are people like you who would come in from behind the scenes and essentially look at the initial pitch deck that was presented and say, yes, I agree, either this is a good idea, or no, here are 10 pitfalls that we need to clarify with them. If these things been thought about, and are they sort of considering the broader market? And then what I've seen anyway is sort of that third level of presentation is like, have you thought about this beyond it just being in the lab? And are you thinking about like what's going to happen whenever you go to commercialize? What's going to happen whenever you have to, manufacture this thing, if it's something that's going to be, have to have additional structure applied to it, I would say. That's at least what I've seen. I would imagine there are other approaches, but yeah, I agree with you in terms of, making it fit the individual that's in front of you as well.
It's okay as a founder, and this is I've had discussions with some founders, and I sit on a board of such a company, and I've had some opportunities to talk to the founder about this at length, is understanding what the expectation of that founder is, right? So if you as a founder expect to take your company to IPO, it's not going to happen. Your expertise is not that. Your expertise is developing a product to a point, and it's okay to say, when we get to the point of commercialization, we are going to bring in the expertise that we need to make this successful. It's a complicated discussion, but a lot of founders feel this is their baby, right? This is very personal to them.
Right.
And that's hard. But I want to contrast that with what happens with entities like Theranos. Now, Ms. Holmes was able to stay at the helm of that company as a founder, and we lauded, not I, but she was lauded for that effort. But at the end of the day, she didn't actually have a product, right? That company, I should say, didn't have a product.
Right.
So there was a failure in asking from the investment side to actually look at that IP. They didn't have people like me behind the scenes because it was all through connections, right? And that's where that was built. So I think founders need to understand that they have limitations in what they bring to the table with investors, and they really need to be honest about that with themselves and to the investors. If, for example, we're working on a project right now that is intended to help us with the next pandemic, essentially. And I have often said to people we've been having discussions with investments for, this is a project that is built to be acquired. But if you expect us to go IPO, I'm not that person, and I will happily step aside because it's a totally different skill set. It's not the same,
Right.
As being a founder. It's important to understand your limitations.
Yeah, and I mean, I sort of, I know I've had a fair amount of conversations about this as well. That companies that are going to IPO, you have to also consider the future then of the company, and sort of the attractiveness, I would say, of the broader investment market to invest in your company. And there are a lot of, I mean, I said in Colorado, right? And there are a lot of companies here that I think IPO'd with the idea that, hey, look, we're essentially going to have the next, big unicorn round of investment come, and they quickly find out that there's a bubble, and then that bubble sort of retracts, and then they become almost like a penny stock.
Yep.
And so it's a very tough sort of situation, and it's one of the things that I know I've also had the same discussion with companies that look, if you IPO, I essentially would like to exit at that point. So similar sort of situation that I just don't want to be there, because it sort of leads to all sorts of reporting and other things that essentially aren't about getting the end science to market anymore either.
Yes,
It's a
that's not to
different
say it can't be done, but the circumstances have to be right. I mean, you have an MBA, I have an MBA. There's no way in heck I would take a company IPO. I just,
right.
unless I had a whole cadre of the experts on how to do this and lawyers, and maybe that's what it takes. But I don't think that provides the shareholders the best value ultimately.
Right. So Vishnu, thank you for your question. I appreciate that. John, I'm going to take you to the last three questions here. It looks like your image is frozen on my side. So for anybody that's watching and John looks like he's frozen, it's okay. We still got you. And I'll continue on. So John, the last three questions start with, what inspires you?
I like helping people. And my mother was a pediatric AIDS nurse. And I've seen the importance of diagnostics in the infectious disease space. So I'm very interested in helping people. Always been driven that way. So that's my ultimate driver.
Very it's I mean it is an interesting sort of question to ask, of people, what might possibly bring them to this point as well. And we have you fully back. You're back.
I switched cameras. So.
Right. Yeah, it's funny because I have one camera. It's the one that we're on, that when in between times it seems to either freeze or go to sleep. And so similar sort of situation where I'm having to make sure that this camera is going to work through the broadcast as well. Second question, what concerns you?
This is actually really personal to me as a virologist, having lived through a pandemic I never thought I would see, quite honestly, in my life, although I guess I shouldn't be surprised. What really concerns me is that I've been a part of the discussions in the diagnostic space post 9/11, all of those years ago, about biological surveillance. especially microbiological surveillance. And nothing really has changed, even having gone through a pandemic. And I've seen some tremendous efforts to try to have better reporting, better testing, whatever the issues are. And we just can't seem to get past the X factor. I don't really know what that is. It's multifactorial. So that really concerns me because, again, as a virologist, I know that this was maybe saying this out of turn, but I think this pandemic was a baby pandemic. I think it can get much worse, and I think we may be faced with a situation where it will be much worse. Well, we're not actively building out what we need to do to help combat that. So that's what keeps me up at night, and that's quite honestly what we're working on at the moment.
Very good. Yeah, it's interesting to think about because there are so many people I feel like that have even warned of COVID before COVID happened. Look, this idea that, these pandemics, happen only in third world countries, isn't necessarily reality. And, it could touch all of us at some point in time. And all of a sudden that day was here. And I remember also being a skeptic as well. I remember when, COVID was happening and they were talking about, look, we are going to essentially stop having people go into the workplace. And I remember telling my wife, I was like, I can't imagine that that's going to happen. And all of a sudden, we essentially to go to work, if you didn't have, essentially a letter that deemed that, it was vital that you go to work, you weren't to go to the office. And I was like, isn't that a surprise?
Well, actually, you and I had very, very different reactions to this because it was in late December 2019 that I remember telling my family, this is going to get really weird and potentially really ugly. And this, you can't shut down a city of many million people if something significant is not happening. So again, I think it took all of us by surprise, and it's easy to forget. We as a country are pretty isolated, at least in our minds. But I'd like to remind you and whoever's watching that I think it was July 6th of this month, we had the most number of planes ever in the air in that day. It was 174,000 flights or something ridiculous. And the percentage of people who were masked on those planes was, probably less than 0.01%, meaning we are all continuing to be perfect vectors for whatever is next. And if you're watching, then reading the publications on H1N1 and other things emerging, we're not doing ourselves any favors right now.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Last question. What excites you?
I'm excited for the younger generation of scientists. Honestly, it makes me a little, I don't know if verklempt is the right word, but a little jealous, perhaps. I have a son who's doing research in astrophysics, and he and his generation of scientists are really deploying these amazing modern tools related to big data and big data analysis. The amazing work that was done on the viral genome sequences, and it just blows my mind what they're working on, and I'm pretty envious, but I'm really excited to see the stuff that's coming out.
Yeah, I remember. This is well, it takes me back a little ways. I think it's probably like 6 or so years. I was working with a company called API out of Issaquah, Washington, and they were working on a super resolution microscopy project. So they essentially brought this technology to market and were selling it to researchers in terms of being able to look inside the structures of cells. And one of the scientists that explained to me is like, look, imagine that you sort of get a picture with a lot of things that you can't see because they're around a corner and things like that. Essentially, what we're doing with math is figuring out not just the structures that you can see, but also the ones that are around the corner and below your feet and other things. And he was just, really energetic about this. And so, if anybody's listening from API and you talk to Steve Reese still, his words still resonate with me because it's amazing what, good scientists can do. And I can only imagine, on space exploration, the same sort of thing, right? Just
It's
amazing.
going to be crazy.
Yeah.
And biology in space is, oh man, I was born too long ago.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Well, John, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate you sharing with me everything about Folio, and for especially staying up so late in Hawaii to be with me. So thanks.
My pleasure. Thanks, Don. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Life Science Success. For complete details about this podcast, including show notes, how to get in touch with guests, and more episodes, please visit www.lifesciencesuccess.com. If there's someone you'd like for us to invite to the show as a guest, please let me know by sending me a message at the podcast website. Please click subscribe on your favorite podcast app, share the podcast, or tell a friend about it. And last but not least, rate the podcast. Thank you again.